It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And of course, this segment, as always, will be no exception to that. We got a good one for you. We're going to be talking a little bit about rock and roll music, memoirs of a music junkie, L.E. Calico, a brand new work called Sex, No Drugs, and Rock and Roll, Memoirs of a Music Junkie. Should be an interesting discussion indeed. For more than 35 years, L.E. served as president of the Music Business Reference Incorporated and editor and publisher of its information service, New on the Charts. It was established in 1976. The service is widely used by music executives in both the United States and internationally. He was also the co-founder and president of Integrated Video Marketing, a TV, film, and video production company with all kinds of national clients. We're going to be talking about all kinds of things in the music business and his life in the entertainment business. L.E., how are you, my friend?
I'm fine. And actually, the book is really about the early years. The book is about a very horny little musician trying to make it in the music business during the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And the overall concept behind it was, and is that I began to feel that my baby boomer generation went through the same maturation process as the country itself. When we were young in the 50s and the early 60s, it was post World War II. We were innocent. We could do anything. Everything was black and white. As we became teenagers, the country went into rebellion and revolution. And then as we became cynical, the country got cynical with Watergate and Nixon. So all of that affected me personally and affected the music and affected the times. So the book is kind of tying all this together through this journey of this little guy trying to make it in the business as the world changed around him, and the music changed as we were doing it. And so that's the overall theme of the book. So
share with our listeners, how did you get involved initially in the music business? I mean, not all baby boomers, but many baby boomers listened to Top 40 radio, and then they kind of graduated on up to album-oriented rock radio stations. Some of them did. There were lots of concerts that all started about 3 hours late. The equipment never worked right, and none of them were sponsored by Sprint, and none of them were sponsored by Kentucky Fried Chicken, but they were certainly memorable times. Tell us a little bit about how you how'd you break into it? Did you start off with like a garage band, or how'd you do it?
Actually, I started off, I sang Kisses Sweeter Than Wine at the 4th grade dance. And then I became popular at all the birthday parties as a little kid. And I really wanted to meet girls, so I kept singing. And in the 60s, as the folk movement started, my mom and dad had me playing trumpet, but I couldn't sing through that, so I got a guitar, and I could sing with the guitar. And it was a time when the folk movement was happening in Greenwich Village, and all of us kids in high school were going from one coffee house to another. And back then, there were coffee houses because we weren't old enough to drink. And there was the Bitter End and the Gaslight and the Cafe Wa and the Fiend John, all these clubs in Greenwich Village. And we would go from club to club on Hootenanny night, which was open mic night, and get on a list to sing, and then go back later and try and get on and perform. And the best ones were then picked by the club owners to play later on in the week, where you could pass the hat. And then the best of those were allowed to open for some of the bigger acts as it progressed. So that was my progression. That's what happened with me. Then I went off to Indiana University, a nice big university in the Midwest where they had a great music school. Because I had this feeling in the back of my head whenever I was performing that somebody out there in the audience was thinking, oh, if this guy only had training. So I got training. I went to IU and I watched the professors and I took some private lessons and realized that I really didn't want to be a classical vocalist. I didn't like the operatic kind of singing. I was used to singing on a microphone. And so at least I found out that what I was doing was right, but I didn't particularly want to go that route. And then things progressed. When I got out of school, I was very lucky. I did a big concert at Indiana University because I was playing in I had a band that did all the fraternity dances, and I had a jazz group that performed in the area, and I played acoustic guitar in the Kiva in the lounge. And so I was able to do a big show at Indiana University, and someone from Chess Records saw me in Chicago. And so I was off to Chicago for my first record situation, and that's how it all progressed from there.
You know, you mentioned some places, like, well, Village Vanguard's more jazz, but you mentioned like Cafe Wah and some of those in the Village. Man, you had people like Clapton and Hendrix that would drop by and play at those places.
Oh, yeah, there were all kinds of great musicians and comedians working at the time. You'd have guys like George Carlin that were working out his things there. Anyway, there was a whole series of people that were playing during those years in those clubs. It's interesting, too, that people don't realize or remember at this point that at one time there were singers and there were songwriters, and there were two separate situations. The singer-songwriter was a new phenomenon in the 60s, that people actually started to write and record and do their own material. Started with Dylan doing things like that. And then what happened also is as the anti-war movement started and those of us that were somewhat liberal bent started wanting to say something about that, we began writing songs about that. And all that happened, and there were things like when there was a shooting at Kent State, 4 dead in Ohio. Things like that were reflecting the times, and were great musicians very much commentating on what was going on around them. And that started in the Village and then went on from there.
If you just joined us, we're talking to L.E. Calico. We're talking about sex, no drugs, and rock and roll. Brand new work he's got out, Memoirs of a Music Junkie, talking about his life in the world of music, not only as a performer, but also as a writer, and also some behind-the-scenes work as well. Now, you yourself, I have a question for you. I know you were an opening act for everybody from Richie Havens to Van Morrison, Jefferson Airplane, and some others. Was that as a solo act or with a band?
Yeah, it was a solo act, and part of the reason I got to do that is because I was a solo act. What happened with the Van Morrison and Jefferson Airplane was I was playing in the bitter end, and the promoter saw me, and he needed someone to get out in front of the curtain and play while the bands were setting up backstage so they could set up. And as far as the other acts, a lot of the folky acts, obviously that was because what I explained before, where I went through that progression and then was able to open for them on a big night. But pretty much by myself, although I did put a group together at one point. And when I was trying to go for a record deal, I really felt like just me alone wasn't enough. So I had an interesting thing where a bass player came over. We were watching an Allman Brothers show on the lawn in New York and in Central Park, and this bass player, who I didn't know was a bass player, guy came over, sat down next to me, and he saw me with my guitar and decided he wanted to be my bass player, and he was going to join my group, which I didn't have yet. So then he introduced me to a guitar player, and we started performing as a trio, and so that happened for a while, and then actually when I was performing at the Mercer Arts Center, which was in the recent TV show, Brian the Final. When I was performing there, the head of a record company came to see me with my group, and we got a record situation as a result of that.
I'm just curious, we're kind of jumping ahead here just a little bit, but
Sure.
you spent several decades in this business. If baby boomers had a rock and roll career, you were certainly a good example of that. What, in your opinion, is fundamentally different about the rock music business today than it was, let's say, back in 1975?
Oh, yeah, the business has changed absolutely dramatically, and it's been a very, very substantial change. The Internet set up a whole new world. Once there was streaming and downloading, and the CD gradually gave way to people wanting their music for free, my service, the service that I had been doing for years, what I did is I kept track of everyone behind the scenes in the record business. When a record hit the charts, who was the manager and the producer and the publisher and the agent, and it was used by all the major record companies and people in the industry. By 2011, I had to close it up because they were all out of business. CDs stopped selling. The music business itself had changed so amazingly that now artists have a very, very hard time making a living. It's very different from what it once was because you can't sell your music anymore. The music is more a loss leader to create a brand.
Yeah,
that's a very different situation.
It's interesting. It's like a funny double-edged sword. It's the ability. I remember I had some friends that made it actually in the music business, but to get just a single record cut was like climbing Mount Everest 30, 40 years ago. Now you can get your stuff heard around the world in a matter of minutes, but there's so much out there. It's almost as if, how do you weed through the clutter and get yourself noticed?
And what's more is you're not getting paid anything for it anymore. The streaming services pay, a quarter of a cent or something like that. The whole business has changed from the music itself to creating brands, to find a way to catch the public's attention and create a brand for the artist. And then the music becomes advertising for that artist's brand rather than the opposite, rather than the other way around.
And the artist ends up doing things like also co-hosting TV shows and everything else versus just going on tour. What about, talk to us a little bit about the touring aspect of the business back then. I'm curious as to what was like for you out on the road.
Yeah, I didn't tour that much because I didn't have any my record deals kept falling through, so I didn't have the money behind me to be able to do it. But I did get involved with the company where we were doing actually concert promotion and talent management, where we were putting on concerts. And at the time, it was, and then I was involved with management. So I was involved with an artist named Larry Coryell, a great jazz guitarist.
No kidding.
We put it together, the 11th House with Alphonse Mouzon and Randy Brecker. And as you said, you know who these guys are. They were just terrific. And it was the same time as the Mahavishnu Orchestra was playing, and it was Chick Corea. There was a whole jazz fusion thing happening. And we had Larry on the road, and some of the situations that would go on trying to keep the band together and get them all from one place to another when a truck would break down and they had to be in another city miles away later on with all their equipment, and those kind of things happened. And what's more is there were situations with promoters that they weren't the big corporate promoters like there are today. There were all kinds of independent little people like I was producing concerts, and some of them were a little less reputable than others, and sometimes you get paid and sometimes you wouldn't. And there was also a whole situation of whether there were unions involved or not. If you got into a bigger act situation and you got into a bigger venue, then you had to deal with the unions, and that meant feather bedding with lots of people that had to be there and had to get paid. Whereas if it was smaller acts, you didn't have quite that kind of problem playing in a venue. All that stuff was going on at that particular time. And I learned about that as a talent manager and decided that was an area that I really didn't want to be in. It was just very difficult. Well, anyway, go ahead with that.
Well, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck here, of course, at Lewis at Large Radio, and got a good one going here, talking to Ellie Calico with a brand new workout called Sex, No Drugs, Rock and Roll, Memoirs of a Music Junkie, about his career in the business. Let's tackle that right away. Why the very, very conspicuous no drugs in the title? Tell us about that.
Okay, well, that really is just a quirk in my personality. I happen to be one of these people that likes to be in control. I'm a control freak. And so I had a real problem with anything, and still have a real problem with anything that takes away that control for myself. So I don't drink, I don't do drugs, and the drug situation also I really think is a real problem in this country with the pharmaceuticals that keep pushing drugs for everything when it's not. If you just eat properly and exercise and take care of yourself, you're probably a whole lot better off than taking all these various medications. So I have this thing about the drug business itself and drugs, and so that was what happened with me. And it was interesting, too, because I was very different from all the other musicians that I was around at the time. So I was often the designated driver.
Well, the book is... it speaks quite a bit about what went on in the past. I'm curious, do you still keep track or in contact anymore with any musicians you performed with in the past?
Well, actually what happened was the music changed. And the book is about the 60s and 70s when I was performing quite a bit. As the 70s, the end of the 70s, the 80s, the music changed. I was very much into singer-songwriter music, blues. As we got into punk and then disco and then new age and then rap, I really didn't identify with that kind of music and became much more involved in the information service that I've been doing behind the scenes, hoping and waiting for the music to come back around for me. And as a result, I really lost touch with a lot of the musicians I had been working with, because it was like 10, 15, 20 years of not doing the business music itself, but in a whole different head, becoming a music industry exec rather than a musician. So although I too talk to some of the guys every so often, and I'm still in touch with some of the engineers, but one of the fun things that happened with this book is, as I was writing, I went back and found cassettes of music that I had played back then. And I was able to then digitize that and drop it into the book. It actually brought me in contact with some of the musicians again, calling them again, remembering about things that we had done. And now I put out, along with the book, is an album of the songs. So as you're reading and you're talking about it, you can actually go back and hear some of the songs that I'm talking about in the book. And in the audio book, I mixed the music in, and we've got an ebook coming out shortly. They're still working on it because it's kind of a new technology now, to actually have while you're reading the book, you can click on it and hear the songs as I'm talking about them. And that was really, really fun for me and exciting to go back and remember all that stuff and touch base with those guys again. So thanks for asking the question, because that just reminded me again of all the friends that I started to touch base with that I had forgotten about for so many years or hadn't been in touch with.
Well, one of the tunes on the disc is called Subway Rider. I can imagine what that's about.
Yeah, well, what happened is that was back in the early days of the subways, they weren't air conditioned. There was graffiti everywhere. There were signs every place on the for where you could get a new job, and for Marlboro and the Marlboro Man up there, and we were all squished in. Anywhere around rush hour, people were literally squished on top of each other. And so that particular song was about the experience of riding the subways in New York during those periods when you were really impossible to even move, and sweating on top of each other. And I get a little carried away with it, if you listen to the song. I kind of get a little carried away with some of my music. I wrote another one called Wish I Was a Lady So I Could Be a Whore, where I got some reaction, some positive and some negative reaction, depending upon the audience. And I didn't mind getting into that kind of political stuff every so often when I was writing things. And that was Subway Rider, particular song. Anyway, yes, there's a couple of interesting situations where I got into commentary with my music.
Well, okay, so you spent a career bouncing around the music business, so to speak, involved in publishing and in videoing and all that, and now you've got a memoir out about it. Interesting, and it's not an evil tell-all at all. It's just kind of a fun look back. What are you doing now, and what are your plans for the future?
Well, actually, this is really all-encompassing for me right now. I'm spending a lot of time now trying to make people aware of the book. It's very much like being like an artist again. Being a writer is very similar to being an independent artist, trying to get people to listen to your music, trying to get people to look at the book. And it's just as daunting now because, as you mentioned before, there's so much out there. It's now, the internet just opens As a matter of fact, when I first got the first half of the book done, publishers didn't know what they could do with it. They said it wasn't a history, it wasn't a memoir, really. It wasn't a tell-all. They didn't know how to market it, and so it pretty much didn't fit in a category that could go into a bookstore. So I just kept writing, and now with self-publishing, I didn't have to wait for somebody to say, "Okay, you can put it in the bookstore here." I can put it out myself. But the downside is that there's so much else out there. So I'm fighting the same battle as I fought as a musician, trying to make people aware of the book, and then hopefully be able to write more. I'm learned how to blog. I've learned how to do this kind of things because I have to become a social networking person now.
Yep, it's a little bit different gig out there. It's a little bit more than sending a record company a cassette, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. And I really fought the social networking thing for a while. I really didn't want to have. I couldn't understand why people all wanted to be on all the time and know what everybody was doing all the time, and it took some pushing to get me into it. But now that I'm writing these blogs, it's kind of letting me let some steam off a little bit, and I'm kind of enjoying it.
Yeah, it's a nice way to be out there. Well, listen, again, everybody, interesting book indeed. Sex, No Drugs, Rock and Roll. Memoirs of a Music Junkie by L.E. Calico. And if you research hard enough, you can find out what the letters L and E stand for. But that's another show altogether. Hey, let's share with everybody, if you would, how can people find out more about the book, get a copy, and maybe find out a little bit more about some things you've got going on?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks so much. I have a website. It's lecalico.com, and it's Kalikow. Also, the books are on Amazon. The album is on iTunes and Amazon. And the ebook should be out shortly. But all the information, and there's excerpts from the book, and there's sound samples and things like that on the website. So it's lecalico.com. And again, Miss Forder, thank you so much for letting me do this.
Oh, listen, we're happy to have you here. Best of luck with the book. And you know what? Further on down the road, who knows? Maybe we see you on YouTube, right?
Okay. I'm working on that, too. Thanks again.
All right. Take care. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large. Well, welcome, everybody, to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And, of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future in this segment. An interesting one indeed. We're going to be talking about you and what happens after the dreaded word, or could be considered a dreaded word, retirement happens, with someone who has got quite some strong opinions and some great ideas about it. Her name is Susan Spalding. She's an award-winning businesswoman, consultant, and published author of a brand new book called Recalibrate for Life 2.0. Her consulting firm, Recalibrate Strategies, was founded immediately upon leaving her partnership position in a top 50 global marketing research firm, where she had merged her brand performance consulting firm Market Directions. Her work as a business strategist, innovative market consultant, and master facilitator focuses on leveraging insights about a business, its brands, its customers, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, a lot of that business speak, PR gobbledygook. Happy to have her here. Susan, how are you, my friend?
I'm very good, thank you.
Well, you know, let this subject of retirement, good gosh, baby boomers, let's face it, it's been all about us for the last 60 years. Why should it be any different now as we head into retirement? Give our listeners a little bit of a background beyond the work in advertising, marketing, brand development, and research that you've done. Why suddenly this interest in a book in particular about retirement?
Well, that's a good question. I didn't really expect to become a consulting resource for senior leaders and business owners thinking about retirement, but here I am. And it really started out with my own questions about Life 2.0 as I was exiting the partnership that you mentioned. And, you know, being an observer of human behavior, it just came very naturally as I was reconnecting in the Kansas City community and talking to other successful business leaders, and they were quite interested in talking with me and learning about my story. And pretty quickly I figured out it wasn't really my story they were interested in. It was their story and how to create their own exit strategy and their own way of thinking about Life 2.0. And it just was very intriguing to me to understand how so many very successful people were really unprepared to think about how to frame who they are and where they wanted to go in Life 2.0. And as you said, you know, it has been about baby boomers, so why not it be about baby boomers again and let them reshape what that R word means in the future?
Well, I don't think, and I think we all understand this, I don't think this generation is one that wakes up every day thinking, I can't wait to ride in a golf cart in Sun City, Arizona. There are some that want to do that, but this is certainly a generation that has shown so far anyway, a much more desire to volunteer time, do a lot of travel, a lot of self-discovery stuff, all about us, of course. And are you finding similar stories out there?
Absolutely. In fact, I just had a note from one of the executives that I interviewed for my book, and he was asking how things were going. And oh, by the way, he was heading for China next week to consult with an emerging market there and to help them begin to frame up their marketing strategies and stories. So that's just one example. Another example is someone who's been traveling the world and now is really traveling the world with great purpose and trying to contribute back to wherever they go and to be on a real continuous learning cycle for themselves as well. And so, yes, there's as many stories as there are people retiring in terms of what they want to do and how they want to do it, whether it's volunteering or consulting or finding another career opportunity.
And again, this isn't necessarily all just those, so to speak, that had a white-collar profession. I think you're seeing this in many ways across the board, are you not?
Oh, of course. While my book has started out focusing on business leaders, it absolutely transcends whoever you are and whatever you accomplished. And it's really taking what you've accomplished and what your interests and your passions are to rework that into something that you want to do.
What are you finding that, would you also agree in many ways that boomers, or a large portion of them, they may say they're retired or think that they are, but in reality, like the person you referenced going to China, they are still very much involved in some level, either with nonprofits or frankly with the profit community, in some kind of consultancy or advisory capacity?
Without question, people are simply redefining and recalibrating what they want to do. They may not have to do it at the full level that they've done it throughout their career. They may want to choose to work 30 hours a week instead of 60 hours a week. But they want to do something. They want to contribute. They want to be engaged. And they want to keep learning and exploring and experimenting. And, that's really what, to me, this is all about, is giving yourself permission to experiment and explore what you want to do. And to try to do that in small ways. You don't have to do something big to figure out whether that's something you want to do. You can carve off little pieces and parts and say, that is something I like. That is something I want to pursue.
Well, let's get, and again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, talking to Susan K. Spalding, a brand new work by her called Recalibrate for Life 2.0, Transition Stories for Business Leaders. Susan, let's sort of do a case study. I am we'll do a composite person here. They're 68 years old. They are definitely going to be retiring when they are 70 from their job, and they are looking ahead towards retirement with a little bit of anticipation, but also a little bit intimidated as well. How do you set them up at first? What kind of advice, what kind of questions and answers do they need to be asking and looking for?
First of all, it's amazing how much head noise is going on for someone like that as they think about or try to think about it. So there are a number of strategies to first take on. One is really think about your community and who's in that community and how you can get in touch with with that influencing community, because you just never know where the opportunities might surface. So if there's somebody that you'd really like to reconnect with, reach out and reconnect. If there's someone that you've always wanted to get to know, then take the time to get to know them. Because again, it's amazing how many opportunities surface as you talk to people and build that social network around you. And you need a bigger social network than those who work with you every day in your workforce, because they have their own network. So that's one thing that will be very, very helpful to anyone thinking about Life 2.0. The other element within that is talking and having conversation about where you want to go and what you want to do, and not feel like you have to keep it held closely inside until you have it all figured out. The other element is again, thinking about yourself and taking time for a bit of reflection and really taking inventory. So it's not just about the skills and expertise that you've developed over your career, although that's certainly important, but combine that with other positives about who you are and what you like to do. So think about your skills and your assets, but also think about your passions and other positives that surround you. And that way you can begin to think about your purpose and start reflecting on your purpose and your passion and your personality in terms of how you want others to view you. And then you can begin to create what you want your Life 2.0 brand promise to be. And that is really what it's about, is just identifying how you want to show up for yourself and for others, and then all the different ideas that you can think about in terms of doing that start to bubble up. And you can begin to see those ideas and cluster the interest groups together, and then choose some small-scale experiments to try those ideas out.
So, Susan, again, you spent a lot of time, traveling. You were busy. You were consulting. Pretty much, I'm sure, you're spending 60, if not more, hours a week at your job. Talk to us about how did you sort of decompress from that, dial back, and sort of ease into not a sedentary lifestyle, but one that wasn't quite so frantic?
Well, you did describe my life quite well. It was a very busy life, and it was more like 60 to 80 hours a week every week, and I was traveling every single week to the East Coast or somewhere around the world, so it was quite a ride. So decompressing. I did a number of different things. One, it was taking time to really think about what I wanted Recalibrate strategies to be, how I could blend all that I've been doing and what I love to do in terms of working with clients into a consulting practice that still gives great value to the client, but also gave me a much greater sense of freedom. And so I worked on that for several months to launch that business, and it continues to have iterations of design and scope and focus, and I expect it will continue to do so. Since I started, I went from thinking about doing very traditional consulting work that I had been doing to now, as an example, adding a real focus to my consulting practice around succession planning and exit planning so that I can be helpful to organizations and the individuals in being better prepared for continuation of the business and of their particular life situation. So who knew that was going to emerge as a focus of my practice? But it has.
Well, we're not talking about you're getting your finances in order and all those various things, the traditional sort of pre-retirement before I jump off the diving board into my golf cart. I got to make sure I've got, everything lined up. But let's talk about It's a little bit more on the emotional side, and how are you going to handle things. Again, when should someone start realistically starting to be thinking about these issues?
Well, you're right to bring up the financial component, because you do have to have that in place. And that's important. And I can share some stories with you about when that's not worked out quite as some of the business leaders that I've been talking to have gone through their own experiences. But you're right. It is a lot about the emotional component and just being ready and being open to new possibilities and open to experimenting. And that's a lot of what it takes. And when do you start? I think it depends on your particular business situation. When I merged my business, I knew I didn't want to have a 10-year ride with the organization that I was merging with. So my goal was 3 to 5 years, and I exited after 4. So if you're selling your company, it's not something that can happen overnight. You really need to think about it at least 2 or 3 years in advance so that you're prepared to do what you want to do, both for your company and for yourself. And you should start thinking about yourself as an individual as soon as you start thinking about exiting your leadership position or selling your company. So it's really important to start it earlier than you think.
Well, it is a subject that will be in front of us for many, many years to come. About 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every single day, probably for the next decade or so, I would think. The work is called Recalibrate for Life 2.0, Transition Stories for Business Leaders by Susan K. Spalding. Susan, as we kind of start to wind down here a little bit, what are there 2 or 3 must-dos, so to speak, in your opinion, as someone starts to contemplate and plan for what we can call after work, whether you call it retirement or not? And what are a couple things absolutely you'd say absolutely do not do or steer clear from?
Good questions. What I would certainly say that's very important to do is continue to explore and learn and see what's out there. There's so many opportunities and so many possibilities. You just have to make sure that your mind is open to them. The other element is don't allow your ego to be a big stumbling block. A lot of people have been in very exalted positions, and then the next day they're not. And that's hard. So you really need to make sure that you don't put your ego in front of figuring out what you want to do, and recognize that those things change, and be prepared to look for ways to change with it. I remember a story with a business executive that I interviewed, and one of the things that he did, and he'd been the president of a multi-million-dollar company, and what he did, he went back to school. He went and took courses on how to build the best LinkedIn profile, and how to engage in social media, and how to learn how to network again. How humbling could that be? But he did it, and he is doing wonderfully well in building a consulting practice, as well as building an entrepreneurial business on the side. And that's another element to think about. That this is an age of entrepreneurialism. It's not just the millennials that are becoming entrepreneurs every single day, but it's boomers who have never owned their own business or had their own business practice that are stepping into that idea. So don't hold back in thinking about what you can't do. Think about what you can do, and think about how to do it with style and wonder and openness.
Well, listen, I certainly appreciate your observations and appreciate you coming on with us. Again, I want to make sure Everybody knows, again, the name of the book, Recalibrate for Life 2.0, Transition Stories for Business Leaders. Susan, how can people get a copy of the book and maybe find out a little bit more about some of the work that you do?
The book is on Amazon, so you can certainly go there, and it's both in a printed form and a Kindle version. And you can go to my website, recalibrate.life.com, and you'll see the book there that you can link to, as well as some other tools and programs that I've developed to help people think about how to move forward with Life 2.0.
Sounds good. Looking forward to talking to you again. Probably, hopefully not both of us in rocking chairs on a porch somewhere. But anyway, listen, appreciate it very much, and best of luck, and would love to have you on again.
Okay, thank you so much.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.